For a long time, there's a gap between some of those who play games and some of those who cover them professionally, and it seems like it's only getting worse. Many gamers are frustrated with their media's press coverage and the attitude that they've got towards so much of their audience. There are some particularly egregious examples of that this year, and I think it's something that, to be honest with you, is only going to get worse unless we are able to deal with it. Now, of course, as always, be sure to like, sub, and ring that bell. This is the more type of spicy, risky video that could get me in trouble, so it really is appreciated in ones like this. Okay, first, the media focusing on things that are just a far cry from what their supposed audience actually cares about. There's the Cyberpunk 2077 in-game advertisement from June. In this case, those involved were more concerned with assigning blame to CD Projekt Red than they were actually just asking questions that the fans of the game would be interested in. Now, the result of this ended up being that at least 2 outlets were interviewing the same art director, asking her about that in-game advertisement. And while the art director had a great response to their questions, discussing the dystopian elements of the game's world, the topic was framed in media in a very accusatory fashion. There is a distinction between creator and creation that media journalists should be very well versed in. Nonetheless, though, the controversy was drummed up here about the sexualization in a mature game set in a transhuman future. Given the topic, I cannot say that coverage was written in good faith. When a game that core gamers are excited for addresses a touchy topic, their reaction often seems to be to assume the worst. Cyberpunk had another point struck against it by Rock Paper Shotgun and one of their writers who took issue with the representation of the animals and the voodoo boys, claiming cultural insensitivity. Now, I can't imagine many interested in the game world would assume the worst there when it comes to CDPR's take on a really terrible world. And funnily enough, Mike Pondsmith, the creator of Cyberpunk 2020 and a black guy who originally wrote the Voodoo Boys to address cultural appropriation issues, what happened? Well, he took issue with that Rock Paper Shotgun piece. Honestly, that's a piece that was absolute bad faith bullshit from the blogger at Rock Paper Shotgun. Then another example of much the same is the initial humdrum around Modern Warfare and its inclusion of white phosphorus. Now, VG247 posted an article on the in-game kill streak claiming that its use in multiplayer was in poor taste. Now, they later interviewed Infinity Ward at the multiplayer event, and they asked what the thought process was behind its inclusion. Now, again, this was discussed as if the developer's inclusion of a specific weapon was somehow Infinity Ward sort of cordoning its use in war. Like with the Cyberpunk example, there's no way that this is intended to inform or to entertain the audience. Instead, it's just done in bad faith to drum up a controversy and to try to score a nice little moral victory. There certainly are more appropriate questions that could be asked there at a multiplayer event for a highly anticipated game. And really for this, the first thing I've got to wonder is, what the hell are they doing? Do they actually care about the audience? Is that their goal? I would say no, not necessarily. I think that it's a decently isolating thing, that sort of job, and I think it would actually get quite boring. And I think that's why these kind of side takes end up slipping into the coverage so much, especially because they also do tend to be things that can be really clickbaity and really will perform well for their publications. Now, the thing is that I think discussions of things like white phosphorus are actually really interesting. Take its inclusion in other games like Spec Ops: The Line as an example there. What I think the problem here, though, is the accusatory framing of things and the sort of messing up of, a creator has created something, or included something in their art. That doesn't necessarily mean they think it's a good thing or condone its usage. And that's something you really can easily apply back to the Cyberpunk 2077 situation. And when you do, you just see the bad faith that is so commonly being acted in. And really for me, the bad faith, that is the core of this video. It is just, in many examples, completely denying the existence of subtext in a piece of media because the pretext is a little bit iffy. Take the Cyberpunk 2077 transmodel situation, right? The subtext there was that this is an example of beauty in the world and that it's been, exploited for corporate greed. That's the cyberpunk thing. That is obviously something that if you think about the people who are writing those articles and the likes of Kotaku, that's probably something that they agree with, the corporate exploitation of beauty. Yet they were just so keen to throw that subtext out the window and just take the bad faith, misleading thing that was twisting what the creators obviously were going for with the game. And as we continue to round off 2019, another great one is the difficulty debate from earlier in the year, of course inspired by Sekiro. Now, there was some great conversation there, but a lot of the coverage illustrated a big gap. Calls against adding, easier difficulties or accessibility options were referred to as gatekeeping, and in some cases, ableism. And yet again, that is just jumping straight to attacking the character of people who you don't agree with, and it reveals their true goal: to scorn gamers and take a moral win rather than to provide any real value or push the medium forward. And there is this sense of moral gatekeeping that just falls apart under scrutiny, or at least comes across as a rules for thee, not for me situation, because that very same publication that regularly posts about games, objectifying certain characters, often speaking from very moral high ground, also posted an article showing off let's just call it inappropriate content of Pokemon characters and what the author would love to do to them. Now, they later apologized, but not without defending their initial ideas behind the article, an exploration of that content. Now, that publication has been on record for looking down at gamers who enjoy adult themes and content in games. In fact, the $2 million adult Kickstarter game Subverse, didn't get any coverage whatsoever from Kotaku, despite it being, I think, obviously a newsworthy story about a burgeoning and underserved market. Whether you like it or not doesn't matter, it is news. Now, they usually don't shy away from sexual content there, so the silence is conspicuous. For being such a generally sex-positive outlet in their coverage of indies and game-adjacent topics, there's a visible disgust when the particular games aren't aimed directly at them. And this does seem to come from a genuine place of disliking the audience they write from, and it does raise some very interesting questions indeed about what's actually going on over there. Then, of course, for another example this year, there's the one site that posted an article titled, "The 14 Pokemon I'd Most Like to," you can imagine a similar subject matter would be ostracized if it involved, not Pokemon, let's just say. And honestly, if that's the kind of content your site wants to run, sure, go for it, right? But I can't imagine that article having much value to the site's apparent audience, video game people. I mean, that said, it's maybe just serving the wants of the writer, getting some clicks via pure shock value. I mean, obviously there's a market for that topic, but it's going to be niche, and you've got to wonder, why is it coming up like that? Now, it's not to say that this is relegated to more traditional media either, because modern punditry can engage in bad faith, and I'm sure we all know of cases where a reliable Twitter source or a YouTuber missed the mark wildly with coverage. In most cases, these things are accidents, like it probably is with much of the journalists, but, journalism exists as a profession to be trustworthy and to behave ethically. Punditry is separately classified for good reason. It's not intended to be impartial, and the breakdown between those two is a massive hit to customers in the industry. Now, for my point there, obviously what we do is sort of news relaying and punditry. And I will say, from looking at the gaming punditry scene on YouTube, honestly, there's loads of people who show they know nothing about game development and frequently mislead their audiences in a lot of their takes. I think that stuff's actually not fair. I think it riles up audiences, it makes them more angry for no good reason, and most importantly, it just provides anger and not education. So it is totally possible for the punditry to not be good there, and I think there are transgressions on both sides, I would say. At the end of the day, the truth matters. You've got to cover all of it, or at least as much as you can, and you've not got to be selective in your coverage such that it just happens to push a bit of your angle. And I think throughout all media, so that is the journalism angle and the punditry angle, this has been a particular problem throughout 2019. And I think looping back to much of the website coverage, one of my points here is that most of the game's media just seems to no longer work with the intent of providing value to the customer, raising awareness. As I laid out in a previous video, one of the original purposes of journalism was to provide a filter from the companies to cut through BS and to give consumers important info and help them not be exploited by manipulative stuff. Some of that does happen now, from time to time, especially when common enemies arise, but it's difficult for consumers to trust journalists, to actually be on their side when it matters. As an extreme example, one of the worst reviews from a major publication this year was Eurogamer's review of Dead or Alive 6. Now, a significant chunk of that review was focused on the reviewer's blatant and unfair distaste for the game. He compared a character and her father to Ivanka and Donald Trump, hardly relevant, and later said that he just felt too embarrassed to play. Now, while maybe there are valid concerns from his perspective as a consumer, the way that it came across was immature. He called the camera icky. If a player was interested in understanding what Dead or Alive 6 actually is like as a game, that would not have been a helpful review. So you've got to think, what was the intent of writing that? I mean, when we as a community joke about review scores from certain establishments, as funny as it can be, it does indicate a really deep-rooted issue. People have been going to respected YouTubers as an alternative, and it's no wonder why. They actually care about the games and those who play them. Now, that said, there's a very real issue that, the entire business, YouTube and journalism, suffers from. Ad revenue's down, ad blocking is up, and running an office full of people, that is easier said than done. Getting clicked on your content, that can be more important than anything else. That's something we're all too aware of here in YouTube. I mean, the titles and thumbnails that I do, I hate them, but you've got to play the game or else you will be buried by the algorithm. So while I'd explain the packaging that the opinions come in, I don't think it excuses the attitude though, and that's what I really want to address in this video. It is just the making enemies of your core audience that seems to happen so often with games media. I mean, certainly some of the vitriol that riled up members of the game's, community is thrown back has not helped there, but I think the relationship could have been mended with the right olive branches. And while they're not making a fortune, Enthusiast Press at least is making somewhat of a revival here, and it is seeing a lot of positive user sentiment. So far, it's enough to pay the bills, and I suppose that's a good thing. Now, that said, sometimes alternative press can take a bit too much pride in being alternative, rather than just focusing on what really matters, the games and the audience. At the end of the day, is that not what we're all here for? So there you go. I mean, hey, this certainly was a spicy video. It's probably pissed off just about everybody, but at the end of the day, that's kind of what it was supposed to be. I did warn you at the start. Yeah, I mean, a lot of this is just... It's so frustrating from every angle seeing how this stuff goes, seeing how it's so pointless, and I suppose being in a position of, doing media stuff, like just kind of seeing the games that are being played. I mean, sadly, not the actual games, the mind games and stuff that's being played, and just the really dishonest stuff that's just so disrespectful. And, yeah, it really sucks. It's one of the largest problems that we're facing right now because it's ruining the entire discourse. And, that discourse, that is how new ideas are formulated. And for that to be so poisoned is one of the saddest things about this whole decade in gaming. And, I really hope that maybe the niche audiences grow larger over time and are able to band together and be a bit more reasonable, and we can just sort of leave a lot of the, the bullshit behind. At the end of the day, I mean, we've got games like Cyberpunk that seem to be decently hated with parts of the the coverage, but at the end of the day, it's probably going to sell gangbusters, so maybe the market there will somewhat prevail. Anyway, let me know what you think. Thank you very much for watching this video, and with that, I will see you next time.